Welcome back to Inside the Plant, brought to you by United Prairie, your source for real world agronomy insights, fertilizer market updates, and conversations that help you make better decisions in the field. I'm Josh Rund, and today we're talking about something that's on the top of mind of every single grower, and that's fertilizer markets. Prices, availability, timing, it can all have a big impact on your bottom line, especially as now we're into the planting season. Joining me is Mr. Curt Miller, the CEO of United Prairie. Curt, thank you for taking some time today to discuss the markets, trends, and some other topics with us.
Okay, good morning, Josh. Glad to be here. Glad to be part of this morning. Um, Josh says, I'm Curt Miller. I'm the CEO of United Prairie. I have been the CEO since March 8th of 2021. I've literally been an ag retailer my entire life. Started out at a very young age working in operations, filling ammonia tanks, driving tender truck, ran a machine for part of my career. Since we're talking markets, really the important piece of my career, I've been a fertilizer buyer now for 19 years. Been through some ups and downs, some challenging years. If you're in the fertilizer business, you remember the markets in 2008, 2009 were very interesting, we'll say that. And in some interesting times today, Josh, with where the markets are with the Iran war and a few other things going on. So.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Curt. So, Curt, let's take just a quick snapshot of where the fertilizer markets are today as we're really in the middle of planting season. How do you see those markets looking?
Yeah, so as we sit today, Josh, everything for the 2026 crop is pretty well in inventory or on its way, even to get clear through side dress. As we look today, one of our focuses at United Prairie when we're helping growers with markets, with fertilizer markets, is getting them to understand the price per ton is really not what's important. It's how many bushels of their grain it takes to purchase that ton of each individual crop nutrient. We've been tracking that. As I said earlier in my introduction, I've been a fertilizer buyer for 19 years. So we've been tracking that for 19 years, and we compare our local fertilizer price to the Chicago Board of Trade grain price. And we do that at the close of business every Friday. So as we take a snapshot and we look at today, actually I ran this on Friday, but when you look at UAN, liquid nitrogen, today it takes 134 bushels to buy a ton of that crop nutrient. When I say the markets are wild and the markets are high, the 5-year average on UAN is it takes 92 bushels to buy a ton. So we're well above the 5-year average. I'll just tell you the record in the past 5 years is 132, so we actually broke that record. I'm going to leave potash kind of to the end because it's the most boring. When you look at MAP's one that's been high for some time. When we look at the market today, it takes 186 bushels to buy a ton of MAP. The 5-year average is 150 bushels. Not quite to the high. The high over the last 5 years has been 200 bushels. We actually broke that not quite a year ago. So when we look at anhydrous ammonia at today's numbers, we are at 248 bushels of corn to buy a ton of anhydrous ammonia. The 5-year average is 176, but the record high has been in the past 5 years has been as high as 310 bushels to buy a ton. So not quite a record high, but definitely higher than the 5-year average. This is based off of, when I ran this, corn was $4.84 a bushel, $4.84 a bushel. So if you want, I always like to go back in time, okay?
Yeah.
So when you look at a year ago, we have the data, right? So I could go back to exactly a year ago or Friday when I ran the numbers. Corn was $4.56 a bushel. So actually lower than it was when I ran it Friday. It took 110 bushels to buy a ton of UAN a year ago at this same time. When you look at MAP, it took 181 bushels of corn to buy a ton a year ago, And when you look at ammonia, it took 182 bushels to buy a ton of ammonia a year ago to date. So it's nice to be able to go into the data and just go back and say, okay, because so many growers get caught up in, well, this is how much it's going to cost per ton, but how many bushels of your grain is going to take to pay for that? That's what they're going to use to pay for those crop nutrients. So we talked a little bit about the bad, and I skipped over potash, but if we go back to potash and we go to today's numbers, when you look at potash today, it takes 103 bushels to buy a ton of potash. The 5-year average is 112. So we're actually below the 5-year average in potash. Potash is still a good buy to the farmer, even though MAP and all the nitrogen products are out of whack, if you will. Potash is still where it should be. So we go to a year ago. So today we're 103 bushels to buy a ton of potash. The 5-year average is 112 bushels to buy a ton of potash. A year ago, what do you think it was? Do you think it was worse or better?
I'm guessing it's higher than it is today.
It was. So it was 116 bushels to buy a ton of potash a year ago today. So
potash is the good buy or a good buy for farmers today, but the nitrogen is at kind of, some of them are at an all-time high.
yes,
That we've seen. And so is that, Curt, is that a direct relation then to what's going on globally in the market today with the war in Iran and a lot of nitrogen coming from that part of the world? Is that kind of what you're seeing?
it is. So when we look at phosphate, and I'll get into more details on the war here in a second, but the MAP price is due to supply of phosphate in general and the cost of sulfur. So a lot of folks don't understand, but it takes 0.2 pounds or 0.25 tons of molten sulfur to make 1 ton of MAP. And we feel that at today's values, producers are actually losing money making MAP because of the cost of sulfur. Well, they're not going to continue to do that. So we feel that MAP is going to continue to stay at the levels they are today and even move higher. We're hearing that sulfur could go up another $200 a ton. So that cost is bolted onto the cost of MAP. And that's even going to put producers at even deeper deficit to produce MAP. So they're going to continue to raise that price and raise that number. When you look at the war in Iran, the Strait of Hormuz is still closed. It's been closed for 7 weeks. We've heard a lot of chatter, like, well, they're going to open at the war, we're having peace talks, so on and so forth. But you're talking 130 some ships per day going through that on average. That's an average number. And you lose 7 weeks of that. And you just do the math and think about that. Even if it opens, this is not going to get fixed overnight. No. It's going to take a long time.
Yeah, because we're looking at almost 1,000 ships, looking at that time frame, and it doesn't, listening to the news, it just doesn't sound like we're really that close to making a deal over there. So yeah, I think that's something. And part of what we were going to talk about today too, Curt, is if I'm just the farmer listening to this podcast, I'm sitting at home, I'm worried about planting my crops right now and the weather and the rain and the moisture in the ground. How much should I be paying attention to what's going on at a global scale right now?
You look at it from a farmer level, and we hope that farmers will rely on us and other people in the industry to help them with information. And we send out a weekly update to our sales team to forward out to our growers that gives them some bullet points, right? So it saves them time from having to spend all their time and effort on what's going on. And they can concentrate on putting a crop in the ground. That's really our hope. But if farmers would focus on a few things, again, I mentioned it earlier before, and it's looking at how many bushels it's going to take to buy a ton of each crop nutrient and thinking of it that way. Always knowing what their break even is. This is what it's going to take me to raise a crop. Here's all my input costs. This is what all my needs are to get through this growing season. And setting a budget. And set that budget within reason and stick to the budget. And then they know what their break even is at the end of the day. Okay? And they can sell grain accordingly. But if they don't know all those numbers and they're just going to say, well, I think that's a good price, I'm going to sell grain, to me, that's a dangerous place to be.
Yeah. Okay. And I like putting it in that perspective of the bushels that it's going to take to buy those crop nutrients. I think that's a different way to think about that than I've heard of before. And I think that's a good way to think about it, especially in today's world with the pricing and the highs and the lows of everything. And those numbers are out there. I know if I was a farmer sitting at home, like, well, Curt, I don't know how to access the averages or looking at those things. Us at United Prairie have, just like Curt said, have done a lot of that work ahead of time for the farmer. And so every single week we send out a 5-year comparison update that usually goes out on Friday afternoons, Friday morning, that looks at those numbers. They put those numbers in front of the farmer. And so while Curt's going through those here today with us, those numbers are things that you can be sitting at and have at your fingertips, and those come through UP Connect. And so if you're listening to this podcast and you're not on UP Connect with your United Prairie salesman, I would encourage you to get on it, because that gives you access to these numbers, this information that Curt's going through today, so that you can start to make some of those decisions based on that data that a lot of farmers sometimes just plain don't have the time to put together. We're doing that for them. So I think that's a great thing that we're doing for them. And Curt, we've been talking about, we mentioned earlier the cost of nitrogen and how nitrogen supply and the cost is high. What is that telling farmers to you?
So yeah, not only nitrogen, but when you look at phosphate, Josh, phosphate's been high for a long time now. We're over 2 years that phosphate's been above the 5-year average. And I want everybody to understand, it's raising that 5-year average as it moves along here. And again, we talked about it earlier, it's just due to the phosphate supply continues to shrink, cost of sulfur is high, and the phosphate market's really looking for that 20% reduction, and they haven't seen that yet. Now, am I sitting here saying once they see that reduction, the market's going to get back to normal? I don't know. I'm concerned with the phosphate supply being where it's at today. It's going to continue to shrink. Are we at a new norm for phosphate? I hope not. When you look at nitrogen, yes, supply's tight. At United Prairie, we're very fortunate to have a lot of UAN storage. We can literally store 75% of our UAN needs. Now this year, a lot of growers lean more toward anhydrous ammonia, just because of that cost per unit of N spread. Encourage the grower to use more anhydrous instead of UAN, just so they could save some input cost. And as we look at the season, we had some surprises. More growers used anhydrous, but the anhydrous season, we was able to run a fair amount in March. We had several days in April, and the supply constraints really didn't cause us that much heartburn, if you will. When we look at, we had a few terminals that went on allocation this spring season. So therefore we had to haul some loads farther than we'd like. But at the end of the day, we was able to work through it just fine.
Okay, good. Well, that's great. That's a tough thing to navigate, I think, sometimes for a farmer, is those input costs and what that's going to be. Because at the end of the day, you've got to raise a crop that's going to produce enough and give you enough ROI that you can, feed your family and keep your tractor and your combine moving. And so understanding that market, I think, is very, very important, especially in today's world where every little penny is starting to count. And so thinking about availability, and we've talked about that a little bit, are there any supply concerns as we move forward through the rest of spring and get into fall? Is the phosphate supply, like you said, do you think it is going to drop off, or is there any light at the end of that tunnel?
Yeah, so when you look at phosphate for fall, and I'll be honest with you, that I would not be surprised if we don't see some phosphate offers and some talk about locking phosphate in for fall soon. From our standpoint, we haven't started down that path yet. I think that is going to happen soon. But when you look at supply issues, I think we're going to have some challenges. Now, when I say challenges, is that we're very fortunate here at United Prairie that we have rail opportunities where we got rail here at Tolono for dry fertilizer, and we have rail at Crescent City. And then we can also pull from river terminals if need be. We'd rather just use our rail assets and have that product moved into our hubs that way. But if we have to pull from river terminals to give us other options, we can. And I imagine we're going to have to do that to make sure that we can cover all the needs of the customers this coming fall season. But it is going to be more challenging. We're going to have to plan ahead. One of the, what are we recommending growers? What do we want growers to do? If we know a grower's needs, and I don't think farmers truly understand how important this is, but if we know a grower's needs early, and I understand we can't get those needs exact down to the pound, I understand that. But the more accurate our forecasting is, and the earlier we know our growers' needs, the better buyers we can be from a cost standpoint, and the more supply we can have in place and ready for that farmer ahead of time. And not only have it on hand in an inventory, but we can set up loads to be delivered on certain dates. Now, granted, weather can mess that up, so I understand that. But if we know a grower's needs and we can't store it all, we can order product ahead to be delivered later on to have those needs fulfilled. But if we don't know a grower's needs and we're finding those needs out right ahead of application, that just don't work out.
Yeah. And so having a plan is the best option.
Yes.
I mean, planning ahead further than we're comfortable with probably at this point for some farmers is going to be important, because even though, today's May 4th, farmers need to start probably thinking about the fall and thinking about late summer application and what we're going to be doing and what their plan is going to be, and at least be aware of what that plan is and letting your agronomist know what you're planning to do at that point, or having that conversation with your agronomist on what it is that's going to be best for your farm and your specific fields. Coming up with those plans early is going to be helps us with the buying. Just like anything else, it's no different than any other part of anybody's life. If you go grocery shopping 7 days a week, you're going to spend more money than if you just did it on Sunday.
That's a very fair analogy.
Yeah. So that's good advice, and it's something that some farmers are good planners. Some farmers do a lot of things ahead of time, but there are those this will be uncomfortable for them, and so we're going to have to. That's what United Prairie's here for, is to help those farmers through some of those uncomfortable times and helping them come up with the plan. Rely on other people. Rely on some of these people who are experts in this area to help you and help your farm. That's what we're here for. With margins getting tighter, how, when we think about what recommendations we're making to that farmer, how should growers balance the investment in the fertilizer, investment in crop nutrients, investments in fungicides here this year, with the risk that they're going to take with the market, the flexibility of it? How do you think, Curt, they should balance that out?
Yeah. So we talked earlier, you got to have bushels to pay the bills, and you got to have bushels to buy crop nutrients. It's really, when you're looking at crop nutrients, making sure your soil tests are up to date, looking at what your needs are from a soil test standpoint. And when you look at potash, like I said earlier, potash is still a very good buy to the farmer. Phosphate's not. And you're looking at your soil test and you're sitting there saying, well, I can afford to keep my potash levels where they are and maybe even improve on them a little bit, but I really can't on phosphate, just because phosphate's so out of line. And hopefully soon farmers will have the opportunity to buy phosphate at a more affordable level. It may not be that it's a cheaper price per ton, but we talked about being, the cost per bushel, right, Josh? Yeah. And hoping that grain climbs to where they can have the affordability for phosphate looks better. I think that's what it's going to take. And so many farmers are sitting there saying, well, I'm going to wait for the price of fertilizer to come down and that's going to fix everything. No, it's not. We have to have grain. If grain moves up a few cents a bushel, it's better than fertilizer falling a few dollars a ton from an affordability standpoint for the farmer and a profitability standpoint for the farmer.
Yeah.
But you going back, and I mentioned earlier, knowing their break-even costs, looking at their soil test and knowing what their crop nutrient needs are. Okay, they got a crop protection needs as far as keeping their fields clean. You mentioned fungicide, increasing yield and protecting that plant from falling apart ahead of harvest. But if they know what their true production costs and their break-even costs are, then they can set some goals. But like I said earlier, setting a budget to help them be successful through these times of thin margins.
Where, Curt, from your perspective, do you see when guys are looking at those soil tests, which I guess I should probably ask just for our listeners here, how often should farmers be testing their soil to see what their nutrient makeup of their soil is and what their needs are?
You know, for the most part, our customers are testing every 3 to 4 years. There's some that test every other year, but for the most part, it's every 3 to 4 years. And I think that's ample time for them to have a good foundation and a know of where their soils really are.
Yeah.
So I know Kyle and I talked here last summer. I mean, we've had a few falls where some growers are taking soil tests in the fall, and our falls have been really dry, and that can skew the data, if you will, on a soil test. So we got some more growers pulling some samples in the spring where there's adequate moisture, and those soil tests can be accurate. And we want them to have the accuracy. That's vitally important.
Yeah.
More vitally important to always, but it's more important today when we got to do everything right today when margins are thin.
Yeah. Yeah. And so having that good information, once again, good information is paramount today, whether it's data from those 5-year comparisons and looking at the cost of your inputs based on the bushels it's going to cost to buy you those inputs, to your soil test to make sure your crop nutrients are in there that you need and you're not putting on extra that you don't need. And so those are all things, that your agronomists that we at United Prairie, we can help with. We help farmers with those things and with those decisions and with those services, to make sure we're getting that stuff taken care of and being taken care of responsibly, as well. Because that's another thing, thinking about your crop nutrients and things like that is the stewardship of the land and what we do and what we put into our soil. Curt, is there anything, that you've seen lately with, some of the environmental aspects of what we do? Is what's United Prairie been doing to help with, some of that stewardship of our land with some of the environmental concerns that have come around lately?
I'll start by saying that farmers are the most responsible and best stewards of the land. They always have been. They always have the mindset they want to leave it better than when they found it, and that's a good philosophy. But when you look at variable rate technology has been around for the mass majority of my career, and it's advanced, advanced throughout my career and got more accurate. When you look at today's, there's biological products that we sell today to help crop nutrients, phosphate, nitrogen, be more available and we can be more efficient today and we didn't have those in the past. And we're utilizing those where it makes sense. We're studying them to make sure that they work and make sure they do provide a return on investment to our customers.
Yeah, and I would say we kind of mentioned in the last podcast too with Kyle Meese was, it's looking at the technology we have with the See and Spray sprayers and the variable rate technology that we have, not just blanket applying fertilizer or blanket applying ammonia throughout your entire field, like looking where the nutrients are needing and putting the nutrients exactly where they're needed. There's not many other industries out there that are working as hard to make less money than the agronomy or the ag retail industry. We're trying our best to be profitable as a company, but to also be great stewards of the land with our farmers and teaming with our farmers to do that. And I think it's working. I think we're doing a good job. I think our farmers are doing a great job, just like you said, Kurt, and have for a very long time. And we're also helping them be good stewards of the land as well from the things that we provide for them and the services and equipment that we have as well. And and Kurt, I guess as we're coming towards the end here, is there anything that we left out that we need to talk about when it comes to the markets or the global economy and farmers? Is there something that we need to hit on?
As we sit here on 4th of May, we're literally at the 1st of May, and people may think I'm crazy, but if a fall fertilizer offer comes out, my ask is that farmers keep an open mind. It could be our best opportunity as we move forward here. Don't know until we start seeing those numbers, right?
Yeah.
And we start putting things together. But keep an open mind. If you've got soil tests that are in, kind of start looking at what your needs are for the 27 crop. Looking at see what you could potentially sell some grain for the 2027 crop, so that you can start laying out some comparisons compared to fertilizer if some numbers come around. I know it's early. I know we still got a lot of crop yet to plant. There's a lot of beans planted today. Still a lot of corn to be planted. Still some soybeans to be planted. We still got a ways to go before the 2026 crop is done. And I know it's hard for everybody to, be finishing planting this crop, but be worried about 2027. But I really think that's important as we look at, making plans and setting ourselves up for a successful 2027.
Yeah, making that plan, like we've been talking about that for a while. In this episode is coming up with a plan. Making a budget. Sticking to that plan, sticking to that budget. There's a reason you came up with it. There's a reason you thought that it was going to work well, and so sticking to that will be important. Kurt, I really appreciate you sitting down with me today, and it was some great insights. I think it's great information for our farmers and even anyone wanting to listen that's not a farmer. It's great information to have to understand our world and the world of agriculture and ag retail and what we do every single day. I'd be remiss. I'm an old educator. It is Teacher Appreciation Week. I also know a lot of farmers' wives are educators, and so I want to thank our teachers, our local teachers, for everything they do for us and our children, and helping raise the next generation, and especially those FFA and ag teachers out there too. We want to thank them during this Teacher Appreciation Week too. And so thank you everybody for listening today on Fertilizer Markets with Curt Miller, our CEO here at United Prairie. Those things out in the field, they don't just happen. Farmers, ag retailers, and agronomists, we work together to make those things happen and make the best decisions for our farms and for our economy and inevitably for the world as we continue to feed it. So thank you for tuning in to Inside the Plant, brought to you by United Prairie. And we'll catch you on the next episode 3, where we're going to have Casey Hedinger on here at the end of May. So thank you all for listening, and we hope you have a great week and a wonderful rest of the month.